Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bank's webinar. Are you ready? It's a primer for banks interested in the .bank domain name extension. We have 4 presenters today. Our first presenter will be Laura Norrell, ICBA Associate Director, Services, an advocate for key services and discounts for ICBA member banks, managing educational vendor outreach for community banks. We also have Craig Schwartz, FTLD Registry Managing Director, managing .bank and .insurance domain registries. He is also former Chief Registry Liaison with ICANN. John McElwain, Nelson, Mullins, Riley, and Scarborough partner. He focuses on intellectual property litigation and strategy. Voted one of the best lawyers in America from 2013 throughout 2015. He is also Vice Chair of the Internet Committee for the International Trademark Association. And finally, we have Thomas Barrett, President of INCIRCA, the first .bank accredited registrar founded in 2001, the sole registrar serving on FTLD's Security Requirements Working Group. INCIRCA is also a trademark agent for the Trademark Clearinghouse. Our agenda today will be as follows. First, we'll have an introduction to new GTLDs. Then we'll go on to .bank policies, trademark protection, and finally, registration process and costs. I'd like to remind you, if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat box of your GoToWebinar widget. And also, as a reminder, these slides will be online at www.incirca.com/ICBA. There will also be a recording of this webinar online at the same URL. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Laura on Introduction to New GTLDs.
Thank you. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is commonly known as ICANN, decided to expand the generic top-level domains. Those are the letters in the Internet domain name that come immediately after ., such as .com, .org, .gov, from the previous level, which is just a handful, to hundreds and possibly thousands once the expansion is complete. ICANN is a not-for-profit organization, and they coordinate how unique Internet addresses are assigned worldwide. ICANN requires that all generic top-level domains offer a sunrise period, during which trademark holders may pre-register names that are the same or similar to their trademarks, and that avoids cyber squatting, which is when someone takes a URL and just sits on it. A bank must have a trademark granted by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to participate in the sunrise period, and this period occurs prior to the general launch of the new generic top-level domain. Registrars must be accredited by ICANN and approved by the operator of .bank and .insurance, which is the FTLD Registry Services, LLC. The .bank generic top-level domain will launch in May 2015 with a sunrise period, and the .insurance generic top-level domain will launch in the fall of 2015. So community banks with insurance agencies will be interested in the .insurance domain name as well. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So how is .bank different? .bank is owned and operated by the financial services community. That includes a coalition of banks, insurance companies, and financial services trade associations from around the world. Only verified members of that global banking community are eligible to register domains. For banks, it includes charter verification with the registrant's regulator. Domains must correspond to legal names, so ABC Bank is not able to register a URL of xyz.bank. It would need to be abc.bank. And .bank is a trusted, verified, more secure, easily identifiable space on the Internet for the global banking community and its customers. Let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. So what are the benefits of .bank? It is designed to be a trusted, protected, more secure online location for banking services. Each applicant will be verified as legitimate members of the banking industry before being permitted to register for .bank. .bank establishes a solid foundation on which a bank can securely communicate with customers, stakeholders, and regulators. So the security bar is much higher for financial institutions than other companies conducting business over the internet, given their roles as trusted financial intermediaries for their customers. So .bank is poised to be the recognized online platform for growth and innovation in the banking sector. ICBA's role in .bank is quite significant. We applaud the formation of the FTLD registry. That's the registry operator for .bank and .insurance. I'm pleased to serve as a founder, investor, and endorser of the FTLD registry. We believe it's critical to protect and serve the financial services community by creating a secure financial services channel on the Internet. Additionally, we believe it is in the best interest of the financial services industry to own, operate, and govern its own top-level domains. We're also pleased to be working with INCIRCA to help community banks understand and register for the soon-to-be-launched .bank generic top-level domain. As part of that agreement, community banks will be able to access a unique website with information and resources about securing and activating .bank domain names. INCIRCA and ICBA will also host frequent webinars such as this, allowing community bankers to learn about the eligibility for a .bank domain, the registration process, and transition tips. Finally, ICBA members will be able to take advantage of preferred pricing for .bank registrations.
Thank you, Laura. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Craig Schwartz on .bank policies.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to INCIRCA for organizing this webinar and to all the ICBA members that are signed on to participate today. I think this is the third INCIRCA ICBA webinar we've done, and participation continues to grow from webinar to webinar, which is indicative of the tremendous amount of interest there is in .bank and why it's so important for bankers to understand how the registration process works and also how they can participate in a meaningful way. I do want to offer a few quick words about FTLD registry, although Laura did cover much of the territory I would have in her opening remarks. We are a private company, but owned, operated, and governed by a range of banks, insurance companies, and trade associations, and the ICBA, as Laura noted, is on our board of directors. At the heart of what we've been working to do the last nearly 4 years, when the idea and the notion of applying for domains was conceived, to spinning up the company, funding it, submitting applications, and finally getting approval, it's all about creating a trusted and more secure place on the Internet for banks and customers. And this type of change doesn't happen overnight, but it is really important that banks understand that in order to be able to participate and to take advantage of the benefits that come with a .bank domain, that they need to understand the process and to get in early in order to ensure the greatest chance of securing the domains they'd like to have. So when you are ready to use it, you have it and you can launch your new space. As you can see, we were founded in 2011. We have a security requirements working group that spent the better part of a year between 2011 and then again in late 2014 developing the security requirements that are mandated in both .bank and .insurance. And we will revisit those requirements from time to time based upon the threats that we're seeing propagated to the financial services sector, but also as new technologies and protocols emerge to mitigate those risks. We will continually assess what makes sense for us to fold into our top-level domains. We've also got an advisory council that's been working the last couple of years and was instrumental in developing the policies and procedures that govern much of the way FTLD's registration process has been developed. So it's not as if two or three or four people were sitting in a room developing policies and putting it forth as this community effort, but rather a broad-based level of participation by counselors from around the world, as well as FTLD's board members in developing the structure for what we believe is a new and more effective way to serve banks and customers. And as Laura mentioned, both of these domains will be launching this year, .bank in mid-May and .insurance probably sometime in the latter part of the fall. Moving on to slide 10, we talk about the strict eligibility for .bank, and in our applications to ICANN, we stated very specifically that we envisioned .bank would be available to members of the global banking community. Between the work that the Advisory Council and our Board of Directors completed, it developed this list of 7 categories of eligible participants. The first several are regulated banking and or savings associations. We also envision having banking trade associations like the ICBA participate, as well as government regulators if they so choose. The other interesting category is the industry service providers, or core processors is what I've come to know them as. And given the role that these organizations play, and it's a pretty key role for many, many banks, whether it's operating their domain names or even registering domain names on their behalf, providing their online banking services, operating their domain name, their DNS that resolves their domain names, we had many, many discussions about permitting the inclusion of these industry key service providers, and ultimately decided that we would allow them to participate in .bank. Although at the end of the day, when we look at who we think the landscape of participants in .bank will be, we envision that will be largely just the banks. So moving on to slide 11, we talk about the enhanced security requirements that are mandated in all of the domains that FTLD operates. The first being mandatory verification and actual re-verification that will happen every 2 years or whenever your domain name is renewed. I know Tom is going to talk about verification in greater detail a little bit later in the presentation, but what our verification, which will be performed by Symantec, a world leader in security and validating the authenticity of organizations, Symantec will be verifying that the person that's requested the domain on behalf of the bank is actually an employee of the bank. They'll be verifying that that person actually has authority by the bank to register domain names on its behalf. And lastly, Symantec will verify that the names that the bank has applied for are domains that it actually qualifies to have. And we'll talk about naming selection in a subsequent slide. Moving on to some of the more technical requirements, which as a package are unique to .bank and .insurance. DNSSEC, when enabled, effectively creates a cryptographic key associated with your domain name that protects the integrity of the data associated with the registration. And probably the easiest way to explain the value is that when you type in mybank.bank, if it has DNSSEC enabled, you can be sure that you're actually getting to the bank that you intended to get to, versus the possibility of your domain name registration having been compromised and perhaps having that domain name redirected to some nefarious place. DNSSEC is intended to prevent that from happening. Moving on to email authentication, which is intended to mitigate phishing and spoofing by having email providers such as Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo follow specific policies that you'll set for your domain. And when I say policies, for example, you might very well set a policy that says we don't use our domain for email, and thus anything purporting to be from your bank's email address would be rejected by the email provider and thus never get to the intended recipient. Your policy might also be that we only send email from a specific set of IP addresses, and if email, again, purporting to be from your bank is not from one of those authorized IP addresses, The email provider, again, would reject the email, which again prevents it from getting to the intended recipient. So incidentally, FTLD registry just implemented authenticated email, or started to do it this week, on our ftld.com address. And I was surprised when I met with our service provider this morning to learn that we actually had a couple of entities out of China that were purporting to be sending email from ftld.com. And of course, we haven't licensed anyone to send email on our behalf, particularly out of China, so that we were able to have a policy in place that at least has identified that problem is occurring. The next step is for us to set another portion of the policy that would prevent those emails from getting delivered. So I'm proof that this actually works, and I'm really pleased to be able to share that we've had an experience that we can now monitor and mitigate. Moving on to enhanced encryption, ensures that the data you send over the internet using your .bank domain is protected from, for example, data tampering. Multi-factor authentication is something that will actually be implemented by INCIRCA or the registrar that you choose. And what that does is it prevents someone from coming in and gaining control of your account and changing information such as your name servers that might ultimately be used to redirect your domain name to another party. And then finally, the prohibition of proxy and privacy registration services is intended to prevent bad actors from registering domain names and hiding their true identity. Now, given the semantic verification component of .bank, those types of registration should never happen. But we also felt that it would not be appropriate for service providers to be able to make registrations on behalf of banks in their own name, and that is the reason that we've created this prohibition. So we're going to move on to slide 12 and 13, which talks about the naming selection policies for .bank. Excuse me. So domain names in .bank must correspond to a trademark, a trade name, or a service mark of your business. Now, if your business is ABC Bank, then you might want to create names that have ABC or ABC Bank in it. It also might be that you have a trademark, trade name, or service mark in some phrase, for example, the best bank. And under our rules, because you have a right in that name, you would, for example, be able to obtain the right to thebestbank.bank. The policy is intended to be fairly lenient, and if you flip real quickly to slide 13, if you could on the projection, what we have here are several examples of domain names that correspond to the name that you have a trademark to, trade name, or service mark. And there are lots of ways that you can be creative in crafting the domain or domains that you'd like to have. And if you have questions about what might be acceptable and what might not be, I encourage you to check with INCIRCA or the registrar that you ultimately decide to use. So if you flip back, I'm sorry, to slide 12, domain names cannot be a reserved name. There are some reserved names that are required by ICANN, such as country names. There are also names noted at the bottom of the slide, such as common, community, and generics, that FTLD has reserved, at least initially, from registration. We may at some point make them available, but for the near term, they are not going to be available. So again, you can check the list at this INCIRCA link that Tom has provided to make sure that you're not spending time trying to pursue a name that ultimately you would not be entitled to have. Domain names, at least for now, are limited to alphanumeric characters, A through Z and 0 through 9. For example, you cannot have a name with an ampersand in it or an exclamation point. And again, if you choose to go through the INCIRCA pre-screening process, Tom and his team will be able to help you with that. So with that, I will close out the section and turn the mic back over to Andrew.
Thank you, Craig. At this moment, I'd like to turn the mic over to John McElwain so we can discuss trademark protection.
Thanks, Andrew and Craig, and thanks to ICBA. I'm going to speak on trademark protection, which is important in the domain name system for 3 reasons. First, it allows registration in the Trademark Clearinghouse. We've already heard about that. It also impacts and allows for sunrise registration and impacts verification, as we've heard from Craig. And lastly, it allows a bank to protect its mark from having others use it either online or within a domain name. What I'm going to be covering is the intersection of trademarks with .bank, which is primarily going to impact right now the timing of a bank's ability to register their desired domain names. Next slide, please. So we have on this slide a description of the .bank launch process and phases. And I think a good starting point is to cover some of the terminology here. Firstly, you'll notice that TMCH is an abbreviation for the Trademark Clearinghouse, which is the entity authorized by ICANN to serve as a repository of trademark registration data. The Trademark Clearinghouse implements the sunrise period by issuing SMD signed mark data files. A sunrise period is an early registration period that is open to holders of trademarks that have recorded their trademarks with the Trademark Clearinghouse. General availability is, or sometimes known as the land rush, is the period in which any person meeting certain eligibility requirements can register a domain name. The sunrise period is beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on May 17th. The general availability registration period is beginning on 8 p.m. Eastern Time on June 23rd. It's important to note that in all of these periods, it's going to be on a first-come, first-served basis. To be eligible to register a trademark in the Trademark Clearinghouse, a trademark holder, in this case a bank, must own a national trademark registration. As Laura described, that's going to mean in most cases for a bank being the registered holder of a United States Patent and Trademark Office trademark registration. You also can register a multi-regional trademark registration if you own one. That would be, for instance, from the European Union. And these trademark registrations must be word mark registrations, meaning that the words shown on the registration certificate must be separable from any design element also appearing on that registration certificate. If a bank is interested to know whether they have a federal trademark registration, one thing they can do is check the USPTO at uspto.gov. Click on the trademark search database and then click on TESS, T-E-S-S, which is an abbreviation for the Trademark Electronic Search System. From there, you can type in a search to see if your trademark is registered. What is not eligible for registration is a state trademark registration, a common law trademark, such as a business name or evidenced by a business license, or any registration containing a top-level domain, such as .com. And in fact, since we have a plethora of new top-level domains, the rule is, in fact, no trademark containing a period will be eligible for the Trademark Clearinghouse. Next slide, please. As I described, the sunrise period is the early registration period available only to banks that have recorded their trademark registration with the Trademark Clearinghouse. Once that trademark is recorded, the trademark holder will receive a file known as an SMD, or signed mark data file. That file is then given to a registrar such as Encirca to prove that you have the ability to register within the sunrise period. It is taking about a week from this initial submission of an application to the Trademark Clearinghouse for the registration to be approved. So we are recommending that any banks holding a federal trademark begin the Trademark Clearinghouse process by May 10th so that they'll have plenty of time to have that received SMD file back before the sunrise period begins. So a couple points on this slide to keep in mind. The first is that even in the sunrise period, this is still a first-come, first-served basis, and Tom will talk about it later on, the plans you can undertake to be as early in line as possible, even in the sunrise. Second, keep in mind you still must pass the verification required by the .bank rules. And third, the corresponding rule does not apply during sunrise. The sunrise period, as we've talked about, was developed by ICANN. The sunrise period requires an exact match of the domain name that you are seeking to register with the trademark that you've registered at the Trademark Clearinghouse. With that, I will turn it back over to Andrew.
Thank you, John. At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that you can find the slides online at www.encirca.com/ICBA. A recording of this webinar will also be found on that URL after the webinar is over. At the end of this webinar, we will take all questions. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Tom Barrett for the registration process and costs.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, John and Craig and Laura, for that great introduction to .bank and the sunrise period. Next slide, please. So as John mentioned, if you're a trademark owner and you have a national trademark, you can submit that to the Trademark Clearinghouse and participate in the sunrise period. Most of you are probably not eligible for sunrise, so your first chance will be the general availability period starting on June 23rd. As we mentioned earlier, you have much more latitude during the general availability period to register any name that somewhat resembles your current legal name. So you do not need a trademark, register it anywhere. You simply need to be using a particular name in commerce somewhere. It could be an abbreviation or acronym of your current bank name. You can even add generic or geographic terms in front of or behind your bank name to clarify where you are. One of the questions we get a lot is whether or not you are given any preference if you own the corresponding .com domain name. The answer is no, you're not given a preference. And the reason for that is that .bank is a global top-level domain. And so banks are not only applying from the U.S., but also from Canada, from South America, from Europe, from Asia. And so it is first come, first served, without regard to what domain name you might be using today. Registration terms are available from 1 to 10 years. You can apply for as many names as you wish. So for example, if you have one domain name you use for your website and another domain name you might use for a corporate email, you're eligible to apply for both of those. But it's important to emphasize, because of the global nature of .bank, there's no guarantee that you will be first in line applying for that domain name. Next slide. So at a high level, here's how the registration process will work. You will go to a registrar of your choice. There's about 12 that are accredited today for .bank. And you'll be able to enter in your desired domain name, and after June 23rd, certainly it will check for the availability of that name and let you know if you can proceed or not. As we mentioned, the the timestamp of when you actually apply for that name is critical, especially on the first day the registry opens. And so once you determine availability, you will then want to proceed with the process to reserve that name at the registry. And only then does the verification process begin at Symantec. The verification process will take about 2 days. And once you complete that process, the domain name is released from the reserve state and is now free to use by the bank. It's also worth pointing out that you can continue to use your existing website as you do today. So there's no impact to that at all. And that gives you time to do some planning in terms of how you want to migrate to the new .bank domain name. And FTLD Registry will be publishing a migration guide to help banks through that process. Next slide. So how does the verification process work? Again, this only starts after you have been able to reserve that name at the registry. Symantec will go through a series of background checks for the bank by consulting third-party sources. And they'll make sure that, first of all, that the entity applying is in fact eligible for .bank under their local licensing authority. They'll verify that the domain name that you're asking for matches your existing legal rights in some way, or using the word corresponds is what we talked about earlier, and make sure that it's not already registered or on the registry reserve name list. It will check the physical address that you've provided in your application to make sure it matches that of the bank. It will also verify the telephone number that you provide as part of the application to make sure that, in fact, it agrees with the physical telephone number for the bank. And this is very important because as part of the verification process, they will call that number and reach out to the HR department, for example, or some third party that's been identified who can verify that the applicant who submitted the application does in fact is a full-time employee at the bank and has authority to apply for those names on behalf of the bank. So that entire process is expected to take about 2 days, and as Craig said earlier, it will be repeated every 2 years. Next slide. Once you have completed that verification process, you're now the proud owner of a .bank domain name, and there is additional security requirements if you want to activate that domain name. So again, you can continue to operate your current website, say under .com. You can activate your new .bank domain name and simply forward it to your current website if you wish, or vice versa. You can forward your current site to your .bank domain name. But there are some additional requirements that you do not need to worry about today with existing websites. One of them is you must use .bank name servers. That means that the name servers are typically read as I show here an example, ns1.readvillesavings.bank, ns2.readvillesavings.bank. Those are name servers for the domain name, and they allow them to resolve to a website. They allow them to be used for email. Today, your existing website is probably using .com or .net name servers. Those are not eligible to host your .bank domain name. And so you might want to ask your web host whether or not they'll be able to provide DNS for your new .bank domain name. And you can explain to them that it requires DNSSEC, requires DMARC, and must use your .bank domain name for the name servers. As we move forward with the rollout of .bank, we're going to provide additional information about the activation process so that banks have a clear set of guidelines on how they can activate their domain names. Next question, or next slide, please. So what is Encirca doing? Well, first of all, we do recognize that the global nature of .bank And so we want to make sure that our customers are able to get the names they want. And so we're offering a free consultation now so that there's no pressure to scramble at the last minute on June 23rd. And we will pre-screen all the applications to make sure that the names you're asking for are in fact eligible, and that you've identified who might perform the verification when Symantec calls. And what we'll do on June 23rd at 8 p.m. is that we will auto-submit your application to make sure that you get your name ahead of someone else. We've had a lot of questions about what if we don't get the name we want. Well, first of all, you certainly can apply for multiple names as a backup. But if you prefer not to do that, we do have a fallback service which allows you to specify an alternative name that we will submit only if your first choice is not successful. And again, that happens on the same day as the day the registry opens. And we also have a premium DNS service if you decide you don't want to use your existing web hosting company. Next slide. So Encirca's retail pricing is $999 per year per domain name. This includes both the verification and registration fee. ICBA members receive a 10% discount, and so if you want to pay by credit card, you can see the discount coupon on the slide here. If you would prefer to pay by ACH or bank wire or bank check, that's fine too. We do encourage you to first fill out the form on our website so you have your place in the queue, and then you can arrange for payment later. And if we're not successful, you do receive a refund minus a processing fee. Next slide. So I mentioned the optional services. The fallback service allows you to specify a second name that you want us to submit on your behalf, only if the first name is not successful. And so it's a $200 one-time fee. It's something that we typically only is required for the first day of general availability during the land rush. And if you do buy this service and it is invoked because your first choice is not successful, then we will credit your first payment towards the second application so that you won't owe any additional money. We are also offering a premium DNS service, so you can activate this new .bank domain name and set it up so it forwards to your existing website. So it will include all the bank requirements such as DNSSEC and DMARC. It will be a vanity name server using your own .bank domain name. You can use it for multiple .bank domain names. And so if you apply for 10 names, you only need to buy this service once. And this is separate from your existing .com website hosting. And so you'll have to keep them separate for now, although later you can move over your .com domain name to this as well. So this service is launching next month, again with a discount for ICBA members. Next slide. So as I say, how do you maximize application success, especially if you have a fairly common name that's shared with banks in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world? You can start the process now with most registrars that have signed up. And at Encirca, for example, we'll make sure that the names you're requesting are not on the reserved names list, that they're eligible for .bank. We'll let you know if we think you have some competition for those names and when you might have that competition. So for example, we can tell you today if there's already a bank with a trademark in the trademark clearinghouse who might in fact apply during the sunrise period. And so you can decide if you want to identify a fallback name because you're not eligible for the sunrise, or in fact if you would like to be in the trademark clearinghouse as well. And finally, we will also make sure your spot is reserved in that auto submission queue so that on 8 p.m. June 23rd, your application gets submitted as soon as we can submit it. Next slide. So that's all the slides we have for today. I know we're running a little later than we expected, but if you do have questions, we'll answer a few right now. Just type them into your question box and go to webinar. The slides are available online at encirca.com/ICBA. You also can start the order process there and choose to pay now using the coupon I mentioned earlier, or pay later, and we can get the process started with you. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at icba@encirca.com, or you can contact John McElwain at john.mcelwain@nelsonmullins.com. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I'll hand it over to Andrew with any questions you might have.
Thank you, Tom. We have a few questions. Let's start off with the first one. This one may be for you, Craig. Will credit unions be eligible for .bank domain names?
Thanks, Andrew. Credit unions are not eligible for .bank domain names, and in fact, there's a separate new top-level domain that's been created for them. It's .creditunion. So that is the short answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Another question for you regarding corresponding names. Say a bank has a reserved or generic name in their bank title. If they add a prefix or a suffix to the reserved name, is it still reserved?
No, it's not. So if you look at the common community and reserved generic names, all that's restricted is the name that's on the list that and appended with .bank. So if the reserved word is community, then the only reserved domain name is community.bank. If you're Community Bank of Mississippi, perhaps you want communityms.bank or communitybankms.bank. So there is, as I think it was slide 12, provided a number of examples on how you could structure your name. But the short answer is that you can append or create a prefix or a suffix to a reserved name, and it would still be eligible for registration in .bank.
Thank you, Craig. Regarding the Trademark Clearinghouse, does a bank need to be in the Trademark Clearinghouse to register a .bank domain name?
So this is Tom from Encirca. I mean, the short answer is no. You simply are not eligible for the sunrise period, and so no trademark is required to participate in .bank at all. You simply need to wait until June 23rd for the general availability period.
Thank you, Tom. And as a follow-up, if a bank does want to participate in the sunrise period, is there still time to trademark their bank name?
This is John McElwain. I can tackle that one. So if you do not yet have a nationally registered trademark, there is simply not enough time to obtain a trademark registration. For instance, in the U.S. now, the quickest registrations are issuing is probably somewhere around 8 months. So it is too late to obtain a federal U.S. registration.
Thank you, John. And I actually have a couple follow-up questions for you regarding trademarks. If a trademark is pending approval, can they still participate in the sunrise period?
The answer to that is no. It has to be a trademark registration.
Okay, thank you. And could you also repeat what you mentioned about the uspto.gov and how to search for existing trademarks?
Absolutely. So to search for an existing trademark, go to uspto.gov. Click on the link for trademarks, and then in the middle of the page there'll be a link for TESS, T-E-S-S, which stands for the Trademark Electronic Search System. And I think that Craig has posted a link in our to this in our individual chats, and Andrew, you might be able to cut and paste that and post it out to all of the participants.
Great, thank you. And I most certainly will do that momentarily. So regarding general availability, just for clarification, you do not need a trademark during general availability, correct?
That is correct.
So, Tom, this is Craig Schwartz. If I could just add a piece to that. So the requirement in .bank is that you have to have rights to a domain that you're seeking. And it could be a trademark, it could be a trade name, it could be a service mark. It doesn't necessarily have to be anyone that's registered, although registering a mark gives you greater protections if you ever need it. But you could, for example, have obtained a common law right to a mark because you've been using it for 25 years, and that would qualify for a domain name registration in .bank.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Craig. Regarding Encirca and the registrar services, are banks required to use a registrar to own a .bank domain name?
So I'll answer this, and Craig might want to chime in. All new top-level domains like .bank are required to be sold through an ICANN registrar like Encirca. So that is your first step of the process. There are about 12 listed on the FTLD.com website, but certainly you have to go through a registrar in order to start the process.
And that's an ICANN rule for participants on the phone. It's not a rule that FTLD made up, but it's one that we're bound to per our contract with ICANN to administer .bank.
So as a follow-up to that question, is GoDaddy a registrar, and will they be supporting .bank?
So GoDaddy is an ICANN accredited registrar. However, they have not been accredited by FTLD to sell .bank domain names, not at least at this point. So the answer is currently no.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Regarding .bank registration, the price was $999 per domain name with a 10% ICBA discount. Will that be the same price every year for renewal?
This is Tom Barrett speaking. Yes, that is the renewal price as well.
Okay, thank you. And regarding Encirca's additional services, if a bank chooses not to use the DNS Premium service, would this be something that their hosting company would do?
Yeah, they can certainly talk to their hosting company to provide this DNS hosting, so that's why it is optional. So the questions to ask your hosting company is, can you support DNSSEC and DMARC, and can you support hosting of .bank name servers? So it's it might be educational. You might have to point them to some resources for them to come up to speed on this. But if they're familiar with the banking industry, then they should be aware of it.
Thank you. And going back to the price real quick, is that a standard fee across the registrars?
No, it's not. Every registrar gets to set their own retail pricing. We do believe that the pricing that we've established, especially with the ICBA discount, is the lowest in the industry. But banks, of course, are welcome to shop around and see what other registrars are charging.
Thank you. So we have one attendee who has already completed Encirca's pre-screening process. What would their next steps be?
So the next step there is to pay if they haven't already paid. But if they have paid, then they're all set. We will submit their application during the general availability phase, assuming that's when they applied for. We will be alerting them prior to that to make sure that they alert their HR department and or supervisor to expect a verification phone call from Symantec. But once they've completed the process with Encirca and paid, they don't have to do anything else until we submit the domain name for them.
Okay, thank you. And I believe we have a couple more questions. This one may be for you, Craig. Can banks still operate their .com domain name independently from their .bank domain name?
So the short answer is yes.
And can we expect more information on how to transition from a .com domain name from a .bank domain name?
And the answer to that is yes. I think it was Tom that mentioned earlier that FTLD is currently working on what we're calling our transition guide. And the guide will have several components, one including how to communicate changes to your customers and or your employees. Another component is will address the technical elements, and that is what are they, what is the value, and how do you implement them. It may be that the bank's own IT department will be able to handle this themselves, or it may be that they need the support of a registrar like Encirca, their hosting service provider, or perhaps their core processor. But there will be information forthcoming on the how-to, and what I'd like to stress is the importance of getting in early to make sure you get the domain that you'd like to have, and then working through your internal teams, whether it's IT or legal or marketing, on the actual implementation. So we view it as very much a two-step process. Secure your domain so you have it, and then you put it out when you're ready to use it, and whether you tie it to the launch of some new marketing campaign, or perhaps you're in the process of rebranding, tying it to an event seems to be something attractive to consider.
Great, thank you. And as a follow-up to implementation, if a bank owns their own email server, how would they implement the email authentication system?
So I think it's less a matter of the server per se, but it's the DNS it's the DNS record associated with that domain name. So there are what are called text records that would be inserted to the DNS information that are necessary to implement authenticated email. Those three sentences might have sounded a lot more complicated than I think it is, but it's a factor associated with the domain name information record and not the actual server itself.
Thank you, Craig. Our last question will be, do we know of any large national banks that are participating, and is .bank exclusive to the United States?
So the second part of the question is it exclusive to the United States? And the answer is no. It's a global effort. And the first part, with regard to large banks, we're certainly talking to a lot of them, and they sit on our board of directors, so they've been influential in developing our process. The effort for a larger bank to transition is obviously much more complicated than a smaller bank, and I think it's going to take some of them longer to come on. The other thing to keep in mind too is that a lot of bigger banks have applied for their own top-level domains, such as .chase and .city, and so they really are thinking now about what will they do with their branded domain, what will they do with their .bank domain, and what, if anything, will they continue with their .com domain. So there's a larger digital strategy that needs to be considered for banks above a particular asset size.
Thank you, Craig. That will be all the questions for today. I'd like to thank everyone, members of the ICBA, for joining us here. I'd also like to thank the webinar presenters, Laura, Craig, Tom, and John. I'd like to remind you that if you do have any more questions, feel free to contact Encirca at icba@encirca.com. If you'd like to go ahead and initiate your order process, you can also do that at encirca.com/ICBA. All trademark questions should be directed to your trademark counsel or John McElwain at john.mcwain@nelsonmullins.com. You will be able to find the link to the United States Patent and Trademark Office's search engine to verify if you have a trademark or not. That is actually in the chat box of your GoToWebinar widget. And once again, the slides and a recording of this webinar will be found online at www.encirca.com. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.